So you keep track of time. Yes.
But these 20 minutes are so people can interrupt us, or is there like 15 minutes?
Do you have any preference? I was thinking that maybe let's just do it as interactive as possible. Like if people want to interrupt them, us, it's okay. What do you think, Sandra and Roberto?
I think that's fine.
Okay, great. So let's, perfect. I see your slides, Sandra.
Great.
So I think we are recording now. So let's just start on time. So welcome everybody to our session in labor markets in developing countries. I think it's going to be a great. Everybody has 20 minutes to present, and I will let you know at 5 minutes remaining. And please, to the participants in the audience, just make it as interactive as possible. You can interrupt, unmute yourself and interrupt. And Sandra, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So I'm very happy to be here today. The work that I'm presenting is titled Inside the Black Box of Child Penalties, and is joint work with Eva Arceo Gomez and Elia de la Cruz. So there's a recent emphasis on the child penalties, which is the differential impacts of children between men and women as a persistent source of wage differential that has been shown to be modulated by different gender norms and divergent public policies. However, most of this evidence focuses on employment patterns across the US and several Scandinavian countries and Western Europe. However, as we know, in this LACEA conference, developing countries present different challenges to ability of women to work for pay. For instance, gender norms tend to be even more traditional in developing countries. There is still a reliance on extended family members for household services production and as a safety net. And there is also the presence of a large informal sector, which can be both a source of flexible job and a buffer mechanism that has been shown to prevent some women from exiting the labor force. So this raises the importance to create more evidence on what are the impacts of children in developing countries. In this paper, we focus in the case of Mexico. The wage gap in urban Mexico has decreased from 14% to 7%. However, female labor force participation remains relatively low compared to other countries with similar economic structure and level of development. Only 43% of Mexican women participate in the labor force. Furthermore, research has shown that over time there has been an increase in the role of the unexplained portion of the wage gap. This is the portion that is not explained by differences in education, occupation, age, and so on. So we hypothesize that the remaining gaps in the labor force are associated with the role of caregiving, whose burden falls predominantly on women. So what we do in this paper is that we use 15 years of household surveys and we exploit the month of the interview to obtain detailed high-frequency outcomes for men and women in the labor force and also on paid work. And we estimate the gendered impacts of children in the Mexican context. We use an event study framework and then an instrumental variable approach as our robustness check that I won't cover here for the sake of brevity, but the results are robust to this check. And we analyze the impacts of children on paid and unpaid time use. Interestingly, our time frame includes pre-pregnancy, pregnancy, and postnatal periods in detail, which is also a contribution. And also we are the first to study the gender gaps in unpaid labor associated with the birth of a child in the household. We look at the effects on parents and also non-parents, which we could justify the effects on parents, perhaps partly on biological component, but in the non-parents, there is a stronger reason to attribute part of this to gender norms. And we also are the first to show the effect on total hours, both paid and unpaid, and how a gender gap opens in terms of total hours worked. So just a preview of findings, we find a strong impact of children on the labor market of women that begins during pregnancy and persists, such as 15 months after birth. There is a 17 percentage points decrease in the likelihood of women of participating in the labor force, and a decrease in 20% of their income, while men remain unaffected. These changes are accompanied by divergent patterns in paid and unpaid time use. Even for working women and women who work during the entire period and never leave the paid labor force, we see a more than 15 hours increase in unpaid hours, while the increase for men is less than 5. In the case of other household members, we see that women that are not the mother experience a more than 7 hours increase in their unpaid time use, and there is no change for men in the household. We then do an analysis for formal and informal individuals, and we find that women in the formal sector have a more than 60 percentage point decrease in the probability of working right after the birth of the child, but after a year, they almost fully recover, in contrast with women in the informal sector who have a smaller but more permanent fall in their labor force participation, that is more than 20% decrease after 15 months. So the data that we use, as I mentioned before, is the quarterly Mexican labor survey, or ENOE, which is a labor market panel, and that is based on a rotating sample, which means that 21,000 households enter the sample on each round of the survey, stay there for 5 quarters, and then leave. There is time use data for every member of the household that is more than 12 years old, which includes informal and unpaid work. So we can see the effects for all the women in the household. We use an event study framework following most of the literature that has studied the child penalties before, which consists in having time dummies marking the relative periods with reference to the time of the birth. So these dummies go from minus 15 months to plus 15 months. And these alphas, the coefficients of these dummies are our coefficients of interest. We also use age fixed effects to control non-parametrically for underlying life cycle trends, and date-specific fixed effects to control for time-specific factors that affect all people, such as the business cycle. And of course, individual level fixed effects. So these are the results that we find. For the case of labor market outcomes, we first look at the extensive margin. This is labor force participation. And in panel A, we'll look at the probability that women have positive working hours. And in panel B, we look at the probability that women are in the workforce. So in panel A, we see that there is a larger decrease in the short run, because here, because in panel B, if women are using their maternity leave, then they are still in the workforce, but they can have 0 working hours. So the difference between these two graphs highlights the importance of the maternity leave in letting women reduce their hours of paid work right after the birth of a child, which is marked here with the vertical red line. I forgot to mention that the approximated time of conception is marked here with the second vertical line. So here is we can see that there is a horizontal and overlap pre-trend between men and women right before conception, and that the divergence starts after pregnancy. We then look at the differences between women who were working at the beginning of the sample and women who were not working at the beginning of the sample. And we see that while there are larger and more clear effects for women that were working at the beginning, there seems to be a slight pushing further out of the labor force for women here marked in black that were not working at the beginning of the sample.
Sandra, just a clarification question. So do you have like these are women that have a partner, or this could be also single mothers? Okay, I think it would be nice to see the difference of like responses in labor market outcomes for somebody that has another person in the household with an income versus when they are the sole earners.
Definitely, yeah. We could do that, and we are working on deepening the household structure analysis of the paper, because definitely that is key, and it's relevant for the Mexican and other developing countries. Thank you. In the intensive margin, we look at hours worked, and we see that there is a strong dip in the number of hours worked, more than a 60% decrease, both for women that were just working at the beginning and for women who keep working in the labor force all the time. So once again, here we see the role of the maternity leave in allowing this dip right after birth. However, perhaps not so encouragingly, we see that even for women that never leave the labor force, there is a permanent, at least from what we can see from our period of analysis, a permanent decrease of 20% in hours worked in the labor force, while there is no effect for men, neither right after birth nor in the long run. And this will reflect later in gaps in overall time use within the household. Finally, we look at the impacts of children on income, and we see that hourly wage mostly recovers. So we don't see a statistically significant difference in the long run. However, monthly income does decrease. So far, our evidence suggests that it's not a switch to jobs that have worse salaries, but it's driven by them leaving the labor force or just working less hours that are driving an aggregate change in income. Then we look at the effects on unpaid labor. On the left, we see the effects on percentual terms, and on the right, we see the terms in absolute change. I find it very interesting that first we see here the effects don't happen during pregnancy, but they happen right after birth, which gives us more confidence on our results, that they're driven by children and not by something that is happening since before among women. And the second interesting pattern is that while the percentual change is not so different between men and women, they both experience a large 60% increase in their time dedicated to unpaid work. The baseline is so different that in terms of hours worked per week, there is a 16-hour increase in the unpaid labor gap between men and women after having children. And if we take only people who never quit paid work, this gap is still of 10 hours between men and women. So as I mentioned, this reflects in an opening gap in total hours worked per week when we aggregate the total time use between paid and unpaid, and we see that before conception they are more or less zero effects for everyone, and then during pregnancy men remain constant, but we start to see a decrease in total hours worked for women. But after birth, this pattern is completely reverted because there is such a large increase in the unpaid hours worked for women that it offsets the smaller decrease in hours worked in the labor market. So there is a gap in the long run.
Can I ask a quick question? Just how is unpaid work defined? And like, what's the question? Where's the variable coming from?
So they asked them to account for all the activities that they did during the week and how much time they dedicated to each one of these activities. But there are like 6 categories, like cleaning the house, caring for children, doing errands, participating in community things. There are like 6 or 7 categories, and they say how many hours they did.
Right. So the reason I ask is because the decrease we see in women during the pregnancy, then it's something like resting or doing community activities. Those are not considered work. Whereas, like which one? Like, I'm just interested in understanding how is it that women are doing less work during pregnancy? What activity is it they're doing there? that then once they have the baby, they're doing something else that is considered unpaid work.
So what we see is that all of these types of unpaid work are counted equally. So community service is counted equally as to working inside the house and cleaning. So all of those will be in the same batch. We also did it separately for only care work and housework, and the results are more or less the same. So obviously unpaid work outside the house is not driving a lot of the results. This decrease is driven by a decrease in paid, mostly by a decrease in paid work, because here women are working less hours in the labor market, but they're not working more hours inside the household, because here it's horizontal until birth. So pregnancy doesn't have a large effect on paid work, but it does have a large effect on paid work. I don't know if that answers your question. And I think I have 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yes.
Yeah, I'll try to. We also look at the impacts on time use of other household members. So these results are noisier because it's harder to capture, because of the way of the structure of this survey, it's harder to capture what is going on with people outside the nucleus of the household. But we do see a statistically significant increase of more than 5 hours. It's around between 7 and 9 hours of unpaid work for women in the household who are not the mother. This is the aunts, grandmothers, sisters, and so on. They kind of chime in, it's not chime, they enter to help with this work. Well, we see no effect for the men in the household. I'm gonna hurry up. We see, we also look at effects for formal versus informal sector. And I think that the most striking difference here is that we see that women in the formal sector experience a much better recovery than women that start in the informal sector. And this is a particularly concerning pattern and of particularly high policy relevance, because 57% of women in our sample, and roughly that percentage in Mexico, work in the informal sector. So this divergence has potential policy implications, and we have to explore it further. Finally, we do some heterogeneity analysis. I don't have a lot of time, but in the next slides, the takeaway message from the next few slides is that while the effects on wage and on paid hours vary a lot across the distribution of women, the effects on unpaid work seem to be very systematic, being on the same size and same shape, regardless of where in the distribution women are. So in the case of wage, we see that, the effects for the first decile are quite different for the almost no effects that we find in the 9th decile, and there is a lot of progression in the middle between this pattern and this pattern in terms of wages. In the case of total hours worked, we do also see very different patterns for women who work less at the beginning of the sample from women who work more paid hours at the beginning of the sample, and the shape of the effect of children is very different across the distribution. This in contrast with what we see with the effect on unpaid work that seems to be very persistent, systematic, and more cultural, while the other effects might be more ground on economic drivers. So just to conclude, we find that all our results show that women experience a child penalty in the Mexican labor force at the extensive margin, intensive margin, and as a decline in monthly income. We see that the wide gap in unpaid hours and care is a potential factor in further delaying the recovery of all labor markets outcomes for women. There is no effect on the number of weekly hours of paid work by men, while women experience a reduction in paid hours, but that is largely offset by a huge increase in their hours of unpaid work. creating a gender gap of 5.2 hours in the long run in aggregate time use between men and women. We also find that other women in the household that not the mothers also experience changes in their time use patterns. And finally, we find heterogeneity in the effects of childbearing between formal and informal workers that I more or less already described. And to conclude, this study provides further evidence that once women have children, the balancing act of combining market work and home responsibilities becomes more challenging with significant policy relevance. These results motivate to improve childcare services, but also to take actions to foster change in gender roles and cultural norms to also tackle what is going on inside the households. Thank you. I don't find my thank you slide, but thank you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much, Sandra, for the great presentation. I think you have other questions on the chat, so I will let you like just sort them out on the chat because to move to Roberto and keep this on time. But great. So Roberto, you can share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Okay.
You have also up to 20 minutes.
Can you see my screen? It's okay. It's changing, right? Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. I'm super happy to present this paper called Formality Cost Registration and Development of Micro-Entrepreneurs, Evidence from Brazil. I'm Roberto Rocha. This is joint work with, I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley. I forgot to put in my affiliation there. And this is joint work with Alisson de Farias, who is currently applying for PhD programs. So if you happen to be on an admission committee, you can have him as your student next year. So I think to motivate this paper to this crowd in Latin America, I think it's not that hard, but informality has long been a concern for policymakers and economists alike, okay? And in this paper, we will think of informality as exerting legal economic activity without being subject to government regulations. So we're not thinking about organized crime or things that wouldn't be legal if they were under government regulation. So, and informality is particularly relevant and prevalent in micro-entrepreneurs, who in turn comprise a large share of workers in the developing world. So just to give an example of Brazil, if you count of self-employed and employers with only one employee, they account for like around 85% of all entrepreneurs, and they account for 22 to 23% of the whole labor force in the country, okay? And in 2008, 83% of this group that we're referring to as micro-entrepreneurs were informal, okay? And informality also might be important for the economic development for some reasons, just as Sandra motivated this paper before, okay? But it can also reduce tax collection, it can reduce the economic opportunity of these informal firms, it might distort investment, generating misallocation, and exclude these workers from government safety nets, okay? And one of the policies that has been mostly discussed to reduce informality has been the reduction of formality costs, such as taxes, registration, or compliance costs. And it's coherent in many theoretical frameworks, but it's hard to get, I think, in my opinion, it's hard to get good empirical evidence on it, okay? So there's on the side of natural experiments, there is a lack of good data because administrative data almost by definition won't capture the informal sector. Okay, and representative surveys might miss some important population or might not have enough granularity to study these questions. And I think it's also hard to propose an ideal experiment to understand this question because they are usually constrained by the existing tax systems that are by itself, by definition, the ones that are excluding the workers from informality, from formalization, okay? And experiments in this case are usually expensive and hard to have like a large population such that you can capture the compliers in the sample of the experiment. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to show I'm going to revisit the effects of this large program called the Microempreendedor Individual program in Brazil. I'm going to refer to it as MEI from now on, okay? And what did the program do? It basically started in July 2009, and it virtually eliminated registration costs and really reduced compliance costs and taxes for eligible micro-entrepreneurs, okay? And the main goal of the program was to reduce informality, hoping that this would generate positive economic consequences for the micro-entrepreneurs. What we do is that we are going to construct this kind of what we think a unique data set where we observe all micro-entrepreneurs that register their firms through the program. And we observe their labor market trajectory before and after, their formal labor market employment before and after the program, and their micro enterprises growth, even in the case they open new firms, okay? So we're going to use this data paired with household survey data to answer some questions about how this reduction in formality costs generated by this program affected informality and development of this micro enterprise. So our three main questions here are, this first one, did the reduction in formality costs actually had an effect on formal firm activity and informality? And we're going to show large effects on formal firm registration and the number of active firms. Okay, so more than 6 million unique micro entrepreneurs registered in this period between July 2009 and December 2015. The formality rate of micro entrepreneurs in this period rose from 17% to 32% in the country, resulting in an 88% increase in only 6 years of the program. Then in the second set of results that I'm not going to focus today in the interest of time, I can discuss a little bit of who were the individuals that changed that formalization decision due to the program. And I find that compliers were concentrated in the middle of the earnings distribution. They were more likely to be women, non-white, and have high school education than the group that I'm calling to always takers here that would have been formal in the absence of the program, okay? And in the last set of results, I'm going to show suggestive evidence on what were the economic consequences of reducing the cost of being formal to these micro entrepreneurs. And I'm going to find little growth, or let's say little economic consequences, in the sense that these micro entrepreneurs will remain really small up to 4 years where I can follow them after registering as a May firm, okay? Furthermore, I find convergence on the formal-informal earning gaps that I think building up with my narrative can suggest small benefits of formalization. Okay. And I think this paper can add up to this hugely large literature in formality. I think it has a couple of nice features here. Okay, so first, I think it speaks directly to a lot of the literature that is concentrated in Brazil, and it kind of takes down previous results that show that this program had small effects. But I also think that it contributes to in a larger sense, since I'm actually going to be able to track around a huge sample of workers and show that even if you put, like, in this case, 6 million people out of informality to formalization, they're not going to grow, and I can actually follow them and test some theories of informality and its consequences. So just as I said, there are previous evidence on this program, and unfortunately, by the time that this paper was written, which is a Journal of Development Economics in 2008, the data set that I'm going to use today was not available. So they end up severely underestimating the effects of the program because they use the typical employer-employee data set, the HICE data, but firms in the May program are not obliged to report to HICE. So only firms that have one employee are obliged to report to HICE. So they end up severely underestimating the effects, and I'm going to try to explain why. Okay. So the rest of this talk, I'm gonna quickly describe the program and the program's phase. I'm gonna talk briefly on the data, show the impacts on firm entry and active firms in the formal sector. And then I'm gonna skip the part on compliers and go to this question of, do micro entrepreneurs grow with this registration? Okay. So let me just recap and tell exactly what the program did. So the program created this new tax category for formal firms, and the tax category targets these micro entrepreneurs. So these firms are going to have the same benefits as a regular firm. Okay, so they can issue invoices and receipts. These firms can have access to formal credit markets. They become legal towards the government eye, and the owners have social security benefits. And namely, I think the two most important here are maternity leave and benefits in case of accidents. So in the retirement side, it kind of doesn't change much to previous retirement policies that were already existing in Brazil. Okay. Meanwhile, as long as the benefits are the same as a regular firm, costs of being formal change significantly, mainly in two dimensions here. First, registration costs are virtually eliminated. So just doing business estimated that the cost of opening a regular firm in Brazil in 2008, they were around $700, and it would take you 120 days just to register your firm. And basically the program created this website where you can register for free, and in the following day, you already have a firm ID where you can be active through his firm ID. And so registration costs changed a lot, and the costs of remaining formal, which I'm calling taxes, but also compliance costs change a lot. So the counterfactor for a regular firm would have been 4% of their revenue as their taxes, but this May firm owners, they pay a flat tax rate that is a percentage of the minimum wage. This percentage of the minimum wage will change through time, So, and I'm going to explain the program phases now and how the tax rate is. So the program started in July 2009, but it had an implementation phase because the program started only in a few states and there was not a website yet, okay? So the program really kicked in February 2010, where all states are included and the website is normalized. So the registration costs become really low. So essentially in February 2010 is a moment where you have low registration costs and you had a tax rate of 11% of the minimum wage. And 1 year later, they actually further reduced the tax rate, and they reduced the tax rate from 11% of the minimum wage to 5% of the minimum wage. But the program, the low registration costs were already low in this case. Okay. And what is the eligibility criteria for the program? So there are 4 eligibility criteria, and I'm going to explore the last one to identify the treatment effects here. So the first one is that you cannot have other companies, so you cannot be a partner or owner in any other firm. You have a yearly revenue thresholds, okay? So these nominal values are constantly updated to keep up with inflation, but the current threshold is at 81,000 reais, which could be around $15,000 a year. You can only have at most 1 formal employee. And you have industry restrictions, okay? So what are these industry restrictions? So eligibility is defined at the 7-digit industry classification. So those familiar with the Brazilian data, this is the KINAI. So where each digit further classifies an activity. In our sample, we're going to find around 1,300 industry definitions, and 350 of them were allowed to have firms register as me. So how the government chose these industries that were allowed? The list of industries that were chosen was based on this previous tax system, the Simples, that was created more than 10 years prior to the May tax system. So there was no cherry picking. There's not a sense of something that was time and industry correlated that would generate an unobserved shock here. And eligible industries are different from ineligible industries, okay? So eligible industries are mostly in low value added services and retail. So you can think of eligible industries as like clothes, retail stores, or hair salons, or small construction firms. And ineligible industries are usually in health or kind of higher value added services or large manufacturing, okay? Okay, so what is the data that we're going to use? I see a chat question. So what is the data that we're going to use? So we're going to merge these 3 administrative records to construct the main data set. So I think there are 3 essential points that we have on this data set that I want to highlight. First, it comprises the universe of formal firms, including May with or without employees, okay? It has the date of registration, date of end of activity, geography, and it has the 7-digit industry. And for these May firms, the nice thing is that it has the social security number and the name of the owner, okay? So I can actually do 2 more things with this data set, which is first, I merge it to the formal sector matched employer-employee data set so that I can keep so I can track the micro entrepreneur's formal labor market employment history. And second, I can merge that to ownership data sets that allows me to look at the entrepreneurship behavior of these individuals in new firms after they register as May. So I can check how their firms are doing, even if they open new firms. And that's kind of like an outcome here, opening a new firm. So combining these 3 data sets, we're able to follow all micro entrepreneurs' formal labor market employment and their growth, even in the case they open new firms. And I'm going to pair this up with the PNAD data set. For those of you who are also familiar with the Brazilian data environment, is the National Household Survey. It's kind of, let's say, a standard household survey that was collected until 2015, and it has detailed individual level information on employment, earnings, and sector of occupation. Okay, so let me, in the interest of time, I'm just going a little bit fast here. So how we're going to estimate the impacts on formal firm entry and active firms in the formal sector. Okay, so in this first set of results, I'm actually going to aggregate up my firm level data set and create a panel at the industry level, okay? So I'm creating a panel where each observation is a pair that is a 7-digit industry month, okay? And in this panel, I'm gonna track how many firms are entering at each month, are registering, how many firms are exiting at each month, and the total number of active firms and the number of active firms that are not in the May program. And I'm gonna estimate it's essentially a differences in difference. It looks like an event study, but it's essentially a differences in difference specification, where I'm estimating a coefficient for each month So the key coefficient here is beta T, and DS7T is a dummy that indicates if that industry is eligible to the May program, and 0 if the industry is not eligible. And I include a 2-digit industry fixed effect here, times period fixed effects, that allows me to control for aggregate trends in those particular industries, okay? Okay, so let me jump first to the raw entry of all firms. This is not the differences in difference coefficient result. So what this graph plots? This graph plots the average firm entry by 7-digit industry for eligible industries, for ineligible industries, and the entry for firms not in the May program. So let me go step by step here. So just to give an understanding, I think you can see my cursor here. So this graph shows that for the average 7-digit industry, around 300 firms registered in a given month in February 2010, okay? So I think there are 3 nice things here to see. First, there is a clear suggestion in my interpretation that there are no parallel trends, that are parallel trends before the implementation of the program, which is the solid black line, okay? So there is nothing going on in the pre-program period that is differentiating eligible and ineligible industries, okay? I think the second nice thing here is that the red line is solid, it's stable throughout the whole period, okay? So this indicates that ineligible firms are not gaming the system and moving to eligible industries to profit from the Maytag system. And the third thing that is interesting here is that for firms that are not in May, so if I see this hollow line here, it is relatively stable throughout the program too, so indicating that what is driving the increase in all firms in this solid lines here are the firms in the May program, okay? Next, we jump to the differences in difference coefficients, okay? And I think if we pull this together, we would get an effect of around 76% of increase in the formal firm registration, okay, starting in period 1. But the effect is really different between periods 1, where it was that implementation phase, periods 2 and period 3. And the interesting thing here is that there is not much difference between periods 2 and period 3, suggesting that further reduce that I mentioned on the tax rate. I cannot explicitly say that because I don't have the identification to say that, but it's kind of suggestive that further reduction in tax rate is not necessarily what is driving the increase, because in period 2, where the tax rate was already 11%, was still 11%, the firms were already registering a lot. Okay, and this kind of contradicts what, yes.
I just have one question, and also you have 5 minutes, but so how, like, should we interpret, I think you want to interpret this as like there's a movement from informal to formal firms, but why is it not just like there's an increase in the entrepreneurship that came because of this program?
So I do have all these robustness checks in the paper, and I do have them in the slides. I show that there is nothing like an occupational change going on. There is also not like a formal employees becoming micro entrepreneurs. That is not what is going on. Okay, so I won't have time to do that today, but I've done all these results and show that is not what is happening. Okay. Okay, so let me just jump because I have 3 minutes left. I think I didn't time myself right. And so those are results on the number of entry, but this is on the number of active firms, okay? So those were all in registration, and this is in the stock of firms. So you see a constant increase until 2015, and this interpretation gives us that by December 2015, there's an increase of like around 86% in the number of active firms in eligible industries, okay? And this is all driven by firms in the May program. So if we estimate the same coefficient for only firms not in the May program, we see basically a 0 in this lighter green line. Okay. So as I said, we do check all these informality results to see if there is occupational change, if there is a change of people not in the labor force going to the labor force, and that does not appear to be the case. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm just gonna skip to show the last results here, where I'm tracking these firms for up to 4 years after they register, and I'm going to look at the number of employees and the wage bill of their wage bill. So again, this is going to be just suggestive. I don't have a proper identification to estimate what would be their counterfactual if the program did not exist. So I'm just showing that given the program, these firms are registering and what happens to their firm growth. Okay, so this is essentially the firm size distribution 4 years after, 1 year, 2 years, and 4 years after the firm entered. Okay, and what I think it tells us here is that basically like the 97th percentile of these firms are still self-employed. Okay, and 4 years after the firm entered, only the 99th percentile of firms have only 2 employees. Okay, if we compare this to the firm size distribution of the whole economy, we see that these firms are still super small. Okay, so I think this although it's not a precise estimate of what is the impact of the program in firm size, and I think this is just to say that the program did push the 6 million micro entrepreneurs to the formal sector, but it suggests that there was not like something like a hidden pool of talent in the informal sector, that they were driven away from the formal sector because of the high registration costs and taxes. Okay, so it just suggests that micro entrepreneurs do respond to costs to register to formalization, but it's not like the formalization itself is going to propel them to become entrepreneurs as the previous entrepreneurs were in the economy. Okay, so to be out of time, so just to conclude, I think that's the main takeaway. We showed that the reducing cost of formality did induce a large number of micro entrepreneurs to register, and that this is driven, although I didn't show precisely today, this is driven by individuals that would have been informal in the absence of the program, and that does not appear to be large gains of formalization for these micro entrepreneurs in the main program, as the firms remain really small or basically self-employed individuals. Okay, so I think I'm out of time, and thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Perfect timing. Now we have Roberto, second Roberto in the panel. You can share your screen. And also we have 10 minutes at the end of the session just for like discussion. So if anybody have extra questions or want to discuss, we're gonna have that time as well. Okay, Roberto, thank you so much. So the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you all for having me here. Let me check whether, okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes, but it's not
Okay.
in full size.
Not in full, yes. Okay. Okay, better now? Okay, so this is a joint work with Ali Moghadassi Felishomi from Loughborough University, UK. I am Roberto Nisico, and I'm a senior assistant prof at the University of Naples, Federico II. This is a paper on that where we attempt to evaluate the employment effects of economic sanctions in Iran. So just let me introduce with some background behind this paper. So sanctions have become very popular is a very popular foreign policy tool in international politics over the last decades. While sanctions, international economic sanctions, are designed as a non-violent instruments and often are viewed as a more humane options than military interventions, de facto they are, they have the goal of changing the policy of the target country by inflicting severe economic damages. And, there is a huge literature in political science where basically scholars have attempted to estimate the effects of imposing international economic sanctions on a country on the human rights, on the stability of political leader, on the level of democracy, on conflict intensity. So we have a very established literature on that. On the economic side, so there is a growing literature that try to investigate the economic effects of the sanctions. For instance, previous studies have focused on the effects of sanctions on GDP growth, on international trade, on income inequality and poverty, and on foreign direct investment, for instance, and so on and so forth. But surprisingly, there is much less, if not nothing, on the effect that economic sanctions may have on the labor market, which is precisely what this paper about. So we try to fill this gap in the literature by providing first evidence on the impact that economic sanctions may have on the labor market. And in particular, we're going to look at the case of Iran and the case of the manufacturing sector in Iran. Now, first, let me give you some theoretical consideration. Why does why should economic sanctions have an effect on the labor market? So there might be at least 4 different channels why sanctions can affect the labor market. First of all, we know that sanctions is a pure trade shock. So this can lead to a very sharp contraction in imports and exports, which necessarily lead to the reallocation of labor across industries. Then sanctions can cause a slump in international capital flows due, for instance, to the withdrawal of foreign direct investments, and this may ultimately spill over into the labor market. Then sanctions, which are, remember, the target is to try to overthrow the political system of the target state. So by doing that, they can generate uncertainty of the future of the political systems. And then, of course, this can produce adverse effects on the country's trade and financial relations, on the domestic and foreign direct investments, and of course, as a consequence on the labor market. And finally, there is some evidence that sanctions are followed by an increase in the shadow economy, so in the rate of informality, because both individuals and governments are now more incentivized to promote illegal economic activities in order to deal with the impossibility induced by, with some impossibilities induced by the sanctions themselves. Okay, so then, bear in mind that the size of the impact on the labor market might depend on a variety of factors. First of all, the severity of the sanctions, which might be very, from restrictions on just arms to full embargoes or total blockade of the economic activity. For instance, the case of Gaza and also the case of Iran. And then also the type of sanction matters, because there might be unilateral sanctions, which can potentially be circumvented by just switching to alternative trading partners. But the case of Iran, for instance, is the case of a multilateral type of sanctions. And in this case, avoiding the cost of the sanctions, and so the access, avoiding the cost of the sanctions is almost impossible, and this necessarily implies that the target state will lose some access to goods or markets. So what do we do in this paper? We are going to exploit the imposition of a series of unexpected and unprecedented sanctions on Iran in 2012 as a natural experiment to estimate the short-run effects of these sanctions on manufacturing employment at the industry level. In particular, we are going to exploit the change in the industry level import exposures that is caused by the sanctions, and then fit the model for stacked price differences covering 2 subperiods. One subperiod, which is before the sanctions, over 2008-2010, and then the other one is during the sanction period, so 2012 to 2014. So as you can see from the definition of the subperiods, we're going to estimate a very short run effect, but also the very short sample period allows us also to be kind of more sure that we are able to capture the effect of the sanctions rather than the effects of some other policies of the government that might have happened more or less over the sanction period or just before the sanction period. Okay, so what we do then is we try to analyze how the effect of the change in import exposures, which is induced by these sanctions, varies across industries that are characterized by different degree of exposure to international trade in the year before the sanctions. So this is an ex-ante measure of import share because we define it in 2011, and then we test also the robustness when we use the alternative pre-sanction years to define this import share variable. And then we finally estimate the implied changes in overall employment, looking at the direct effects of the sanction as well as the indirect effects of the sanction through the industry input-output linkages. So we are able to construct, the implied changes. So what would have happened in absence of the sanctions to overall employment and to the employment by type of industry, by category of industry, whether you belong to the relatively closed industry or relatively open industries. So our theoretical hypotheses are the following. First of all, so here we are basically in the opposite scenario of what is the China shock literature. So in the China shock literature, so it has always been investigated the impact of an increase in import competition. Here is the opposite, because trade sanctions just cause a stop in trade. Remember that these are the most severe economic sanctions regime ever imposed on a country. So Iran was basically very close to a near autarky because of the sanctions. So this is a decrease, a sharp decrease in import competitions, right? So, and just if we just have in mind the China shock literature, of course, we should expect this to have a positive impact. Also because Iran is a net importer in the manufacturing sector. So Iran, for instance, the manufacturing sector accounted for 19% of Iran's non-oil GDP in 2011. And it also comprised 92% of total imports in 2011. So to give you an idea, the manufacturing sector in Iran is quite important. Though the service sector is, is the most relevant one, still the manufacturing employment accounted for 16% of total employment in Iran. But the most important thing to know is that the demand for manufacturing imports is mainly directed is mainly for capital and intermediate goods, which are complementary in the domestic product for the domestic production. So this is going to be key to understand the results, of our paper. So. Import deflections might be costly under the imposition of multilateral sanctions, because, as I said, under multilateral sanctions, you cannot circumvent the sanctions by trading with another partner, with a non-sanctioning state, because this is a UN sanctions plus a EU sanctions plus US sanctions. So there are three senders here. So our first hypothesis is that the sanctions could generate necessarily the reallocation of labor from relatively closed industries into industries with a high degree of exposure to import competition. So this is our first hypothesis. Then, given the fact that Iran's manufacturing sector largely depends on imported inputs, bear in mind that the vast majority, as I said, of imported inputs are for capital and intermediate goods, which are necessary for the production process. So given that, it is quite impossible that domestic production could entirely replace imports in the short term. So imagine all those industries that heavily rely on important inputs, right? Those industries are expected to face a huge decline in productivity, if not interruption of the production process. So based on this consideration, our second hypothesis is that the sanction could have a negative effects on Iran overall employment, manufacturing employment. Okay, so before I will run out of time, these are the results that we find. So sanctions asymmetrically affect industries with different level of exposure to international trade, therefore suggesting that there are significant employment reallocation effects, which are precisely in line with our first hypothesis. To give you an idea, a 1 percentage point rise in industry import exposure increases employment by 0.2 percentage points for industry with import share below median, while it decreases employment by 0.6 pp for industries with import share above median. Now, this is when we just split above below median in terms of import share as of 2011, so as of the year before the sanctions. When we move, for instance, to the quartile, and we calculate the effects by quartile, we see that moving from the first to the fourth quartile, it gives for the first quartile an increase, while for the fourth quartile a decrease by almost the same magnitude. Okay, so importantly, we find interesting heterogeneous effects. So the effects are mainly driven by labor-intensive industries, as one should expect, and but more importantly, the estimated effects are mainly driven by those industries that heavily depend on imported inputs in the production process. So, so this is going to point to the conclusions that the decline in productivity, if not the interruption of the production process, might have played an important role here as a mediating channel behind this sanctions-induced change in import competition. Okay, and then overall, when we do the computations to understand what is the implied employment change, we estimate that the sanctions led to an overall reductions in the employment growth rate by 16.4 percentage points. Now, employment was growing in Iran even after the sanctions, and what we estimate is that absent the sanctions, the employment growth rate would have expanded by 18,000 extra jobs. This is what precisely we're going to estimate now. So this paper is going to add to at least two strands of the literature. First, first of all, we're going to provide first evidence on the impact that economic sanctions have on the labor market. But then we're going to contribute to and complement the literature on the impact of autarky, because as I say, this is a regime of sanctions that have induced the Iranian economy to close to a financial and trade autarky. And so in some sense, we're going to also complement the literature on the impact of autarky by looking at how such an event affects the economy in the age of globalization, because most of the papers in the literature have focused on the Jeffersonian embargo, which dates back to many years ago. So this is another analysis that can give some insights on how an event such that can affect employment in the age of globalizations. And then, of course, we add to the vast literature on the effect of trade shocks, so the China shock literature, by addressing labor market dynamics following a reduction instead of an increase in import competition, and focusing on developing countries. So, for instance, all this literature on the China shock are mainly focused on the US, with some exceptions also for some papers that have looked at some North European countries. So this is going to be a paper that look at the change, how the change in import competition will affect the outcomes in the context of a developing country. So now, the institutional settings. Since 2006, there were some UN sanctions already in place in Iran, but this mainly targeted Iran's nuclear program. Now, the sanctions we are talking about that we're going to exploit in our analysis that have been imposed in 2012 are, as I say, deemed as the most comprehensive international sanctions ever imposed on a country. And then this basically aimed to bring Iran's economy close to a complete financial and trade autarky. This was a very unprecedented step when the EU froze Iran's central bank's assets and denied Iranian financial sector's access to the SWIFT messaging service, thus basically cutting off Iran's access to a secure international payment system. So, and this is in addition to the oil embargo, which was imposed in 2012, and to a number of US sanctions that have been imposed in late 2011. Okay, importantly, this was so unexpected that the governor of the Iranian central bank, precisely in October 2011, declared that it is almost impossible, if not totally impossible, that the West could impose sanctions on Iran or would block the messaging service, because this would, this would make them ridiculous in front of the whole world. So this was totally unexpected by the governor of Central Bank of Iran. Now, regarding the data, we're going to use the trade data for the period 2008-2014 that we draw from Iran's Customs Administration database that are obtained from the Statistical Center of Iran. Then the datasets includes basically import and export in local currency for 6-digit HS product level, and we convert it in 4-digit ISIC Rev 3.1 by the sheet. Okay, so then we aggregated and merged this data into 116 ISIC industries to match the trade data with the employment data. So we have basically 116 ISIC industries and 2 subperiods. So we have in the end 232 observations.
Roberto, you have 5 minutes.
Yes. So let me skip all the descriptives. So these are just some trends on imports and on exports. unemployment, and then this is my improvement strategy. So basically, we are going to estimate a specification of the following form, where the change in employment for industry J in subperiod T depends on the subperiod dummy, on the change in import penetration for that industry, then whether the industry belongs to the above median, below median group in terms of import share distribution as of 2011, and then the interaction, which is going to capture precisely our first hypothesis, the reallocation, right? So whether this change in import penetration vary, the effect on employment of this vary according to whether the industry depends to the group below above the median in terms of exposure to trade. And then we control for a bunch of characteristics at the industry level and so on and so forth. To capture total effect, we also use the industry export exposure, not only the industry export, but this is almost irrelevant in the case of Iran because export didn't change much while import collapsed. So this is the main results. As you can see here, we just have a specification with just the two period dummies. Then we include the delta import exposure variables, which seems not to be significant. Then when you interact this with the import share as a continuous variables, you see that there is this plus here and minus here when we dichotomize the import share to have import share above below median. This becomes even more evident. So basically this is saying that an increase in import exposures could benefit in terms of employment, so would increase employment in industry below median, while it would decrease employment in industries above median. So of course, remember that the sanctions induced a decline in import exposure. So this means that we're going to have employment reallocations from industries relatively closed into industries relatively open. Then we test the robustness of these results to a number of checks, but I'm gonna skip. But importantly, we conduct a placebo test in which we replicate our main specifications using the subperiods 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, which are both before the sanctions. And we find basically no results as expected. So it means that it's really important to look at the change in import exposures that have been induced precisely in 2012, okay, which coincide with the date of the sanctions. So these are all the robustness checks. As I say, we trim the samples, so on and so forth. Importantly, heterogeneity. So first, we replicate the analysis by quartile of industry, and as I say, we find that the effect is highly asymmetric when moving from the first to the fourth quartile in terms of import share distribution. Then we find that the results vary across industries with different level of dependence on imported inputs. Mainly, the results are driven by those industries with a high propensity to import inputs from abroad, likely, as I say, intermediate goods, which are complementing the production process. And then we find that the results are also driven by labor-intensive industries as opposed to capital-intensive ones. These are the results. And then, as I anticipated, then we calculated the indirect effect of the sanctions via the input-output linkages. I don't have time to go into details how we do it, but this is basically the results. We do not find much in terms of upstream or downstream input exposure, so most of the effect comes from direct effect, okay, on the industry. And then based on these specifications, based on these models that is more comprehensive, we compute the magnitude of the effect of the sanctions. So we basically compute now the counterfactual manufacturing employment, and so we are able to compute and estimate the implied employment changes. And this is the results, basically. This is the net effect in the first subperiod before the sanctions, in the second subperiod during the sanctions, and in the overall sample period. And as you can see here, a minus means job loss, basically. So absent the sanctions, Iran would have experienced 18,000 jobs, more extra jobs. But importantly, you see that these is not homogeneous across industries that belong to the above or below median. Actually, this is entirely driven by those that are below median, which is consistent with the fact that those are also the one that may just be in need of capital or intermediate goods. So to conclude, this paper estimates the short-term effects of the economic sanctions imposed on Iran in 2012 on manufacturing employment. We find important reallocation effects across industries with different degree of exposure to international trade. And we document that the sanctions had an overall negative effect on employment. Now, in line with this paper by Ekes and Zimring, who have investigated the effect of the blockade in Gaza, our results suggest that, especially in developing economies where the manufacturing sector heavily depends on access to inputs from the world markets, trade shocks can have very important short-run adverse effects on employment, likely via a decline in productivity. In this sense, our results offer key insights to the analysis of trade policies, in that extreme and unexpected changes in trade policies, such as economic sanctions, can cause important reductions in trade volumes and, as a consequence, in employment. So, to conclude, our results also expand our understanding on the possible implications of international economic sanctions, a foreign policy tool which is still very much used in international relations, especially by the US, and highlight the fact that we not only have negative effects in terms of human rights, in terms of conflict, in terms of democracy, but sanctions also bring some negative effects in terms of the labor market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Okay, so I'm gonna also put my slides.
Yes.
You can just stop sharing. Yes.
Sorry.
It's okay. See. Okay, so can everybody see my slides? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, for staying until the end. So I'm going to present labor market power, self-employment, and development, and this is sort of joint work with Francesco Morio at McGill and Monica Morlaco at USC. And I think this is like it touches on especially in the first two presentations. So I'm glad that I don't have to define a lot of things. Thanks to Roberto and Sandra. So there is an increase in recent work, both theoretical and empirical work, thinking about labor market power. But this has focused mostly on developed countries. And I would think that it's sort of like a little bit of a pity that it's not have looked at developing countries, because within the labor market, this will not be controversial in this crowd, but labor markets in low and middle income countries are substantially different to the ones in high income ones. And we think that this is particularly true in the sense that they are related to labor market power. And why is that? So first, we have, from the firm side, we have barriers to firm entry and growth. So there's like this cost that Roberto just pointed out about like creating a business, establishing a business. There is also low productivity, and all of these could potentially create employer concentration. And the second thing is that, as also we have seen today, from the worker side, we have one sector, which is the self-employment sector, that is very particular to developing countries. It's very informal. It turns out to be easily accessible, and it's an outside option for workers when they cannot go to wage employment. So what does it mean? It means that from the point of view of the firm, they will see, because of the switching of workers between the wage employment and the self-employment, an upward sloping labor supply, which is a second necessary characteristic for labor market power to be exerted. So we think that this is super interesting to look at labor market power in developing countries for these two reasons, and this is exactly what we're trying to do in this paper. We want to establish whether there is labor market power in low and middle income countries, by highlighting the key role of self-employment in order to understand this. And the second objective of this paper is to think about if there is labor market power and self-employment if they have a relationship. So does it matter when we think about industrial policies that want to reduce labor market frictions, for instance, to increase the size of wage employment? So policies like the one that Roberto highlighted, does it matter that we have labor market power when we want to put a policy that tries to move firms from informality to formality, for instance? Okay. So how are we going to do this? We are going to do this in an empirical setup. So we're going to look at Peru between 2004 and 2011. And the first thing I'm going to show you some novel stylized facts here. So the first thing is we're going to show you stylized facts about employer concentration. And the answer is going to be yes, there is employer concentration in developing countries. The second one is not going to be new to you. There's a huge self-employment sector, like the data for Brazil just Roberto showed, which is very particular. No, it's not entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. It's an informal self-employment sector. So these are these micro enterprises where everybody can just start a shop. And the third fact is that these two things, employer concentration and the size and wages paid of the self-employment sector, are actually connected. So these two things have a close relationship. And I think that's sort of like what points us that we need to understand them jointly. So to do that, we're going to build a tractable general equilibrium oligopsony model with the endogenous-centric to try to capture why there is employer concentration. And on the worker side, we're going to have worker sorting between the wage employment and the self-employed. The result is going to be that labor market power actually comes from two sources. It comes from the source of firms, which is the employer concentration, and this is what people have focused on in developed countries, but it also comes from the worker side. And this is coming because workers are moving from this wage employment, working for firms, to this self-employment that it is informal, that it's very easy to access. We're going to estimate this model using some direct and indirect inference. And this is also like a contribution of the paper because we are not going to focus only on like firm level data, but we are going to merge both firm level data as well as worker level data to try to analyze these two sides of labor market power. So the main takeaways, if I don't make it to the end, is that basically this sorting of workers, this worker movement between wage employment and self-employment is going to create a variable labor supply elasticity, which is a condition for labor market power to be exerted. And this is going to be endogenized. So what we're going to have is going to have variable markdowns. With our model, theoretically, we're going to show you that when there is this sorting between to self-employment, concentration is a poor measure of labor market power because we're going to have two opposing forces. So actually self-employment is going to be opposing the negative effect of labor market power. Empirically, we're going to show you that labor market power not only has the negative effect on, let's say, the formal sector, if we want to call it, the wage employment sector, but also the negative effect in terms of labor productivity and wages permeates to this self-employment informal sector. And then I'm going to show you at the end is that in order to understand what is going to be the effect of any industrial policy that want to increase the size of wage employment, right? The formalization policies, for instance, that how do we tackle this question? It's going to depend on which one of the sources of labor market power you touch. If you touch the one that comes from workers or you touch the one that comes from firms, it's going to have very different effects on labor market power and other labor market outcomes, even though they have the same effect on concentration. I'm just gonna hope that I get to show you that. In the interest of time, I'm just not gonna talk a little bit more the literature, but just saying that, of course, we talk about the literature in labor market concentration and labor market powers. We're trying to put the worker side as well and developing countries. Of course, the role of self-employment and informality with the papers by Ulicea, Dix Carneiro, and what Roberto just showed us, and a more broad macro development literature on labor market outcomes. Okay, so let me tell you quickly about our data. So we're going to use two sources of data, one from firms, one from workers. From firms, it's going to be the Encuesta Económica Anual, which is going to be the annual survey of manufacturing formal firms from 2004 to 2011. And this is, you should think about this as a census of medium and large formal firms, okay? And then from the workers, we're going to have the Encuesta Nacional de Hogares, which is a household labor survey, like sort of, we're going to have two things. We're going to have the cross-section between 2004 and 2011, and a panel data from 2007 to 2011. And what is cool about this survey is that this is the survey that the government uses in order to understand formality and informality, employment and self-employment. So this survey is very well designed to understand, like, what at the worker level, who is categorized as being self-employed, who is categorized as being informal. And we also have industry and occupation. And we're going to focus today on manufacturing industries, and these are like composed 11% of employment. And we're going to extend this to other industries, but today the great data that we have for pharmacy manufacturing. So let me tell you about the facts. So the first fact is that we want to basically, what you're seeing here is two ways of looking at concentration. So this is basically the percentage of local labor market, where local labor market is a 2-digit industry code and it's a commuting zone. The number of firms that exist in local labor markets in Peru, and the concentration measured by the Herfindahl index by wages. So basically, just wanted to point out is that you have 52% of all the local labor markets in Peru that have a Herfindahl index that is greater than 0.9. So it's this highly concentrated. And this is not like, these are not like tiny places, but actually all these local labor markets account for 12% of payroll wages. So it's not that only like the little town in a rural area is super concentrated, but actually the places that are super concentrated have collect a meaningful percentage of employment. Okay, so the first thing, there's a lot of concentration. The second thing is that, as you know, there is a lot of self-employment. In Peru, more than half of the percentage of employment is self-employed. And within all self-employed, as I think this is similar to Brazil, almost all are informal. Okay, and when we move with the formal, these are very, very small firms, micro entrepreneurs. So firms that have less than 5 people, that they are not registered with the tax authority, or where they are registered with the tax authority, but they do not pay benefits and social insurance to their workers. So this is very prevalent. The third thing I want to show you is that these are two labor markets that are actually connected, that live together. So what I'm showing you here is a transition matrix between the employed, wage employed, and self-employment by year. And for this, we use the panel data. So what you see here is that the transition matrix between being employed at time T and self-employed at T+1 within manufacturing, within the same industry, are not trivial. I mean, it's 6% we employ and go into self-employment, and 10% the converse. You might say, but these are small. This is like very large compared to what people have found in developed countries, which is basically almost nothing. And these are like transition matrix of changes, annual changes. So these are active labor markets that are like coexisting, but they have movement across them. So there is a lot of mobility between wage employment and self-employment for the same industry. And the third thing that I want to...
Sorry, how
yes.
come no one is unemployed? No one is
Sorry?
unemployed?
Oh, no. It's very, almost all, if you go to the, so nationally, you only have 4% of unemployment. And in the places where you have higher concentration and high self-employment, almost nobody is unemployed. So this is very consistent with the fact that, you know, self-employment informal in Peru is sort of like an alternative of being unemployed. Yes.
Wow.
And then the last thing that I want to show you in the Silas facts is these two things. So we think about them as dual labor markets that coexist together. They have a relationship, right? People are moving, and this movement of sorting across this wage employment and self-employment generates some relationships. And what we do here is just showing you some correlations between concentration and labor market outcomes. So the first thing that you see is that more concentration decreases the earnings of employees, and this is consistent with like having labor market power, but that's not new. But what we think that it's pretty interesting is that it also permeates through measures in the self-employed sector. So it decreases also wages in the self-employed sector, it increases the size of the self-employed sector, and it decreases average schooling in both sectors if you think about schooling being a proxy for abilities. and that probably decreases productivity in both. So all of these facts basically to us mean that first, we have this high concentration, we have the self-employment rate, we have these dual labor markets, but they seem to be like jointly determining options for workers. We have this mobility between those two sectors, and then we have this systematic relationship between employer concentration and self-employment. So all of this for us is sort of like an indication. If we want to understand labor market power, we need to take seriously the existence of these two dual labor markets. So that's exactly what we want to do in the model. So I'm just gonna quickly tell you a gist of the model. So we have continuous manufacturing local labor markets indexed by K. So we have labor in each local labor market is going to be exogenous. We're going to take it from the data. We're going to have the number of firms that appear in every local labor market being endogenous, and we're going to have fixed entry costs. So for instance, like this is very akin to what Roberto showed about the project. This fixed entry cost will be exactly what his intervention will change, right? So the fixed entry cost to create a firm. We have workers that can be employed in the formal firms. We're going to call them formal firms, or could be self-employed and earn some wages. And we're going to assume that the nationwide, like the output market, is competitive. We're not going to put any structure on that, but for labor market, there's no competition for labor. So firms are atomistic, and they have a certain interaction with hiring workers. So on the worker side, we're going to have a very, very traditional ROI model. We're going to assume that in order to decide where you want to be self-employed or you want to go to the wage employment, workers are going to have some draws from abilities in both sectors, and they are going to decide whether to work in one or the other, given their earnings in these sectors. This sorting, a la ROI, is going to give us an aggregate labor supply that the firm are going to see, and it's really cool is for us is that this is going to give us an upward sloping labor supply. So this is already like. So we're going to have an endogenous upward sloping labor supply that is sort of like a potential, like it's a condition, a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient for labor market power to appear. Okay, so the firms are going to be non-atomistic, they are going to have this strategic interaction. I'm not going to show you the problem of the firm, but what I want to show you is the first order conditions of how do they set wages. What's going to happen is that firms are going to set wages equal to the marginal revenue product of labor, divided by this psi, which is going to be the wage markup, right? So this is sort of like that measure of labor market power in this model. What is this psi? This psi has this closed form solution that is great. So there are two things that basically two sources here you can of labor market power. The first being M, which is the total number of firms in the industry, so that's concentration. And the second one is this elasticity. This is labor supply elasticity that comes from the worker side. So you have one source of labor market power coming from these concentration firms, and the other coming from like worker sorting between these two dual labor markets. So this is theoretically, this is going to have interesting consequences because we usually think in our models when we think about this elasticity being just upward sloping path fix, that the concentration leads to labor market power. But this is not going to be true in our model. So if there is a decrease in concentration, so the number of firms goes up, there is a lower market share. That's going to be a direct effect. But then there is going to be an indirect effect, which is coming from decreasing concentration, increases wages. This increases sorting to the formal sector, the elasticity goes down, and actually that increases labor market power. So these two forces, one coming from the firm side and one coming from the worker side, oppose each other. Okay, so this is going to basically give us our second contribution, which is concentration. When you have self-employment, it's a poor measure of labor market power. So we're going to estimate the model, but in the interest of time, again, I'm just not going to go into how do we deal with this. I just want to show you in the last minutes that I have to keep on time. What do we do with this? So the first thing that we do is that we have estimated a model and we say, okay, how much of this labor market power comes from, or these negative effects of labor market powers come from workers and from firms. So this is almost like 50-50. And the second thing, which I think it's super interesting in terms of like policy, is that there is lots of policies that developing countries are putting in place in order to increase the size of the wage employment. So for instance, one example is the decrease in fixed costs of opening a business, which is what Roberto showed us today. Another type of policy is this training for workers to become formal workers and leave the, let's say, informal side of employment. And another could be just like improving road infrastructure and increasing the productivity of the local labor market. So what we're gonna do is basically look at these three types of policies, right? It's in the model, it's a little bit abstract, but they all can be attached to one particular. We're gonna say, okay, all of this, we're gonna change all of these three separately, such that they decrease market concentration in the same amount. So what you see here is the Herfindahl index, and we say like we have more fixed costs, market access, which is productivity, or ability, we have increased ability of workers to enter the formal sector, such that they decrease this concentration that we see. And then we're gonna say, okay, what happens with labor market power? Because we know that with the self-employment, it's not the same. So as you see, we have decreased these counterfactuals to have like the same change in the Herfindahl index. But then we can calculate what happened with labor market powers in the second row. And basically the effects are very different. So because I don't have much time, I just wanted to put your attention on the last two counterfactuals. Basically, if we increase productivity at the local labor market, so if you increase productivity of all the firms in one particular industry or location, right? You put a new road or you create infrastructure for all these firms. You increase, this has the effect of increasing actual labor market power, making firms that are big in the economy bigger, and they can exert more market power, and the effect of moving to self-employment of workers actually doesn't contribute what you see. In contrast, if you increase abilities of workers, so what you target is, I wanna train my workers to become formal workers. What you see is that you're gonna have a decrease in labor market power, and you're gonna increase wages for both in both policies, but you're gonna do much so if you work with the ability policy. Okay. And this is what the last two rows says, that basically you're gonna have some sorting. If you change ability, you're gonna have some sorting from workers that are very productive in the self-employment sector to the wage employment sector. So they are the ones that are gonna leave and they're gonna take advantage of these policies. And then the self-employment sector is gonna basically become a little bit more smaller, but also you're gonna take the ones that are not as productive.
Can I ask a quick
yes.
question? And how should I interpret the magnitude of the coefficient in the counterfactual of abilities on wages? So
it is a percentage, so it's a percentage increase from our baseline.
Okay, so it's
so this is like 4 times.
Oh, 4 times.
4
okay.
times.
Okay.
Yes. So it has increased 4 times the
wage. Yeah.
The wage.
Very
yes,
nice.
exactly. Okay, so just to keep in time, I want to conclude. So what we are doing in this paper is basically when thinking about developing countries, thinking there is labor market power, but this relates not only to employer concentration, which exists and is pervasive, but also with features of the labor market in developing countries, which include, importantly, the size and the nature of the self-employment sector. To understand this, we build this general equilibrium model with both sources of labor market power coming from firms and coming from workers. I think that's sort of the innovation. And then we want to highlight that once you take into account the self-employment sector, policies that are equally successful at reducing concentration and increasing this wage employment sector might have very different effects in labor market power and wages. And then to understand what are going to be these effects before designing a policy, because there is some like just scarce resources, it's of utmost importance. And this is what I have today. Thank you so much stop share.
Can I ask a question, Pamela?
Sure.
So I found it very interesting, and I think, you know, IO people are kind of like over the Herfindahl index, and it's kind of nice that labor economists are trying to like move away from it too when they think about monopsony. So I like that about the paper. I promise I will have a question at the end, but I just, one of the things that struck me was also the relation between this paper and, I don't know if you're familiar with Diana Van Paten's job market paper about the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica. And they're like, the idea there is kind of like the United Fruit Company is kind of like the sole employer in some of these areas, and they actually end up providing, you know, more amenities to these workers than, you know, living outside of the area. But the idea there is not really about concentration, it's more about trying to have workers not move. So essentially, like by restricting the mobility of workers, you're kind of like exerting your monopsony power. But the weird thing there is that you're kind of like providing nicer things to workers in order to maintain that relation. So I guess the thing I wanted to ask was about it was unclear to me kind of like where that sort of countervailing factor came in. So you were saying if there are more firms coming in, decrease in concentration, then the margin from the worker side is that then they become, their labor supply becomes more towards self-employment, becomes less elastic, and that's what, or could you just rephrase that
So,
again? I kind of missed it.
No. So basically, you have more, you have less concentration, you have more farms coming in, and then that's going to increase wages, right? Because that's going to be the direct effect. So if you increase wages in the wage employment sector, more workers are going to sort to the wage employment sector, so more workers are going to move there. Having more workers there, that's going to affect the elasticity. So that elasticity is going to go down. It's going to become from the point of view of the firm, and that's going to be the contrasting effect to M, right, in our measure.
So the higher wage then makes the from the point of view of the firm, like the elasticity of labor supply to the firm becomes more inelastic.
It is, so we have, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is sort of like, we have to, this is independent of the really the assumption that you put on the ability distribution. So this is like a general result.
But I just, the curious thing, I may have to think about it and see the model. It's like, how does that work? If like, there's kind of this intermediate step that you're saying wages go up, but because wages go up, then wages will go down.
Yes, it's because you have the two sides. So these two things happen at the same time, right? So we have, I mean, this is just a partial, let's say, a partial derivative, right? So you have yes, guys, I was just gonna say, like, as a chair, thank you all for coming. So if you wanna keep talking, this Zoom is gonna still be open, but if you have to go, please do so. Thank you for attending. Now, Lorenzo, going back to your question. So these are two partial effects, right? So keeping so the first direct effect is gonna be that you have if you change, I mean, M is an endogenous variable, but for some reason, if you change M, that's gonna, the first effect that is gonna have that, like, it's gonna increase wages. So that everything happens simultaneously, but
yeah, okay. It's just when you're trying to explain it. Okay.
Yes. Yes. No, but thanks for the comments, and thanks for like people also interacting in the chat. Okay, guys. I have to
Bye.
down to another session, but it was a great to talk to you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.